There we go, great. The people are just now starting to come in. All right. Just give everyone maybe like one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and begin. Thanks everybody for being here today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. We know it's kind of hectic this time of the year with appropriations and everything, so thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Lassard. I am the Senior Government Relations Representative for Defenders of Wildlife. I'm going to be moderating the briefing today. And our briefing is titled the Migratory Bird Protection Act, Restoring 100 Years of Bird Protections. So as you can imagine, we're going to be talking a little bit about Representative Lowenthal's Migratory Bird Protection Act, which is HR 5552, and then also some background on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and why this legislation is needed. So today's briefing is hosted by the American Bird Conservancy, Defenders of Wildlife, National Audubon Society, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. Joining us for today, we've got a great panel of speakers. First, we have Dr. Amanda Roadwall. She is the Garvin Professor and Senior Director of Conservation Science for the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We have Lynn Scarlett, who is the Chief External Affairs Officer with the Nature Conservancy. And I have to note that Lynn was also the Deputy Secretary of the Interior underneath the George W. Bush administration. We have very delighted to have with us Congressman Alan Lowenthal. Thank you for being here. He is the lead sponsor on the Migratory Bird Protection Act, so great to have him here. And then last but not least, we have Dan Ash, who is President and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And Dan was also a former Department of Interior official as he ran the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service underneath President Obama. So after our panelists speak, there's going to be opportunity for questions and answers. So once the last speaker has concluded their remarks, we're going to open up the floor for questions. Throughout the briefing, feel free to type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please just let us know who your question is directed at. That way we can direct it to the appropriate speaker, and we'll try to answer them as many as possible. We do have some of our policy experts on hand in case there are other questions that come up. So happy to have them here as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Amanda Roadwall. Amanda has been having some connection issues this morning. So actually what I'm going to do is she has pre-recorded her presentation. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys and play her presentation. And then after that, Lynn will speak. So thanks everyone. Let me get that rolling for you guys.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you today. North American birds are in trouble. In 2016, the State of the Birds report indicated that over 1/3 of North American birds required urgent conservation action. Today, we have an even better understanding of the trouble they're in after the article was published in Science last fall that described how populations of 530 species have changed since 1970. Scientists from the US and Canada analyzed two different data sources. One from the USGS Breeding Bird Survey, which has been conducted annually since 1966, and the other from weather radar images that can be used to monitor migrating birds. And what they found was shocking. Nearly 3 billion birds lost since 1970. That's 30% of the breeding population, or nearly 1 in 3 birds. Declines span most groups of birds, as you can see here. Sparrows, warblers, and blackbirds had the greatest losses. Declines also span almost all habitats. Grassland birds have lost the most in terms of absolute numbers and the percentage of the population lost, over 50%. There have been big losses among birds associated with the Arctic tundra, boreal forests, and western forests too. Interestingly, the bottom blue bar shows the return on U.S. investment in wetland conservation. Now, the conservation community has worked hard for decades to restore wetlands, and we see recovery of those birds. Now, it's important to recognize that declines are not driven by only a handful of species. Rather, the majority of species associated with these habitats are in decline, as you can see in these pie charts. Now, massive losses have occurred even among once common and iconic species, like meadowlarks, that have lost 3 of every 4 birds and have declines across most of their range. You can see that in these trend maps in the orange and red colors. In boreal forests, evening grosbeaks have lost 9 of every 10 individuals. 6 of every 10 wood thrush in eastern forests have been lost as well. Even the familiar barn swallow has declined, along with other swallows and swifts that eat mosquitoes and flying insects that actually might be bothering you this time of year. Migratory birds as a group have declined by 28%. Now, this animation shows the annual distribution of the barn swallow as one example. So it's easy to imagine how a migrating bird would face a wide range of threats along its journey and over the course of a year. Some of the threats might be related to weather, habitat, or food supply, but others are human caused. So for example, as birds migrate, they risk colliding into man-made structures, whether it's windows on buildings or power lines, communication towers, or other structures. And we know that many of the species that are most vulnerable to collisions are also strongly declining. That's not uncommon to have species of conservation concern being disproportionately impacted by human activities that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act frequently would touch. Of the 172 species reported dead in oil pits, 80 of them are in steep population decline, with several having lost 75% or more of their populations since 1970. And so these impacts add up across space and over time. So the science is clear. We need to strengthen, not weaken, protections for birds. We also need to consider that environments that are not healthy for birds are unlikely to be healthy for people either. Birds are canaries in coal mines. And even more, they provide free ecosystem services like pest control that support human health and well-being. In terms of the economy, bird watchers contribute billions each year. Again, the data are not ambiguous. Birds are in trouble. But we do have the opportunity now to take positive steps to ensure their conservation and recovery. So thanks for being here today to see how we can do that. So now I'd like to introduce Lynn Scarlett, who's the Chief External Affairs Officer with the Nature Conservancy. Thanks again.
Thank you, Amanda. Over 100 years ago, our nation passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It was among the first fundamental environmental statutes in the United States. The law is unambiguous. It states that except as permitted by regulations, and I quote, "It shall be unlawful at any time, by any means, or in any manner, to hunt, take, capture, kill, attempt to take, capture or kill, possess," and many more details, "any migratory bird." 100 years ago, threats to birds were dominated by hunting, slaughtering of birds for their feathers, and similar actions. Some bird populations at that time were decimated. But migratory birds, as Amanda has noted, remain seriously threatened. Over time, the threats have broadened and shifted. These include harms from oil spills, transmission lines, oil drilling wastewater pits, wind turbines, and more. The intention of those actions is not to kill birds, but the effect is nonetheless the harming or killing of birds, and with sometimes disastrous consequences. These threats, though incidental and unintentional, are foreseeable and preventable. The law does not say that killing birds is prohibited only if one intends to kill the birds. Thus, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act provides the legal foundations for reducing unintended and incidental threats. For at least 5 decades, Republican and Democratic administrations have understood the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to prohibit, without permits, the taking or killing of birds, whether by hunting or by unintentional killing or taking of birds. Under the Act, Republican and Democratic administrations have worked with companies, fishing communities, farmers, and others to develop practices that eliminate or substantially reduce impacts to birds. The Act and its application to incidental take has motivated cooperative efforts at problem solving to avoid actions that seriously imperil birds and are foreseeable and avoidable. These efforts have motivated innovations in wind turbine design and operations. They've motivated use of netting or other methods at drilling wastewater sites to avoid bird loss. These efforts have motivated collaboration and problem solving with compliance and enforcement as a backup for inaction to reduce impacts to birds. But despite that long and bipartisan track record of embracing the Act in all its fullness, the Trump administration has dramatically reversed course. First, with the Interior Department solicitor's opinion, the administration asserted that the Act applies only when an activity is intended to, and I quote, render an animal subject to human control. Now the department has proceeded to translate the opinion into a rule. Already the solicitor's opinion is resulting in adverse impacts to birds, whether regarding road projects or oil spills or logging at bird workeries. I'm a lifelong birder, but my concerns about these reversals extend well beyond that passion. Birds are critical to pollination and seed dispersal, to controlling pest populations, to cycling nutrients, and even contributing to soil formation. And we are losing them, as Amanda noted. We need to reaffirm the full breadth of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We need to ensure that foreseeable and preventable impacts to birds, including through incidental and unintentional harming or killing of birds, are addressed. It's now my great pleasure to introduce U.S. Representative Alan Lowenthal, who will present his legislative solution. Congressman?
I'm on. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Scarlett. And thank you for all of the panelists for joining us and everybody who's watching this. This is a very, very clear-cut protection with briefing, and I hope that we all get a lot out of it. I already have learned a lot. As was pointed out, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 is one of our nation's bedrock environmental laws. It has protected thousands of species of birds and has been the implementation language for several international treaties that protect migratory birds. Unfortunately, in 2017, the Trump administration issued a radical reinterpretation of the MBTA, overturning decades of precedent established, as has been pointed out, by both Democratic and Republican administrations, undermining our commitments to international treaties. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has now told companies they are no longer required to avoid incidental harm to birds. Companies will no longer be held liable for damages and now have less incentive to implement best practices to protect birds. Further, while previous administrations have held companies liable under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act when disasters occur due to negligence, like oil spills. This administration has made clear that it will not hold companies liable for negligence. In cases such as the Exxon Valdez or the Deepwater Horizon and other even smaller spills, responsible parties were fined and the funds went towards important habitat restoration efforts in the aftermath of these disasters. A similar incident happening today under the Trump administration policies would not result in a single dollar's worth of fines under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The intent of my bill, which is a bipartisan bill, the Migratory Bird Protection Act, is not to overregulate, but to create a fair system with certainty for industry to ensure that we meet our international treaty obligations and recover damages when egregious situations occur. You know, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has covered incidental take for over 100 years. And in this bill, we make sure that we stay in compliance with our international treaty obligations, and we will continue to cover incidental take. We do recognize that some incidental bird deaths occur. This legislation will direct the Fish and Wildlife Service to work with industries upfront to develop general industry-wide permits for incidental take and develop a system where companies would pay a mitigation fee and self-certify that they are utilizing these best management practices. This way, good companies acting with best management practices are not punished. You know, I'm the chair of the Energy and Minerals Resources Subcommittee, and I understand the importance of energy production, and I also understand the need to promote a cleaner, more sustainable future. This legislation will increase certainty for industry and create a clear path forward for making sure that we continue to develop energy projects in an environmentally sustainable way. I am very disappointed to see this administration move forward with their short-sighted and wrong interpretation. We must have consistent implementation moving forward and make sure that the Fish and Wildlife Service knows that it has the authority to punish bad actors when they kill birds due to negligence. The Migratory Bird Protection Act provides that. I'd like to point out that this legislation is passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee, and its next step is onto the House floor for a vote. There is still a day or two for new co-sponsors to be added. We would like to promote as many co-sponsors for people to understand the importance of the Migratory Bird Protection Act. I want to thank you all again for being here and for all of your support. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dan Ash, President and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you to all the sponsors of today's briefing. I can't help but begin by pointing out importantly that when in framing their policy on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Interior Department created what debaters or negotiators would call a straw man fallacy. You know, they made an argument that the MBTA's strict liability was making criminals of farmers who might tear down a dilapidated barn, or a homeowner who trims a tree, or an automobile driver who hits a bird by accident. And in fact, that argument is just completely hollow. There's no evidence of such enforcement because it hasn't happened. And the history of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act enforcement is unquestionably and radically cooperative. The Fish and Wildlife Service has constructed a broad and comprehensive framework of cooperative agreements, outlining best practices and defining the pathway to MBTA compliance. These agreements span across the federal government, including the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, NOAA Fisheries, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and they include agreements across broad industry sectors like the electric transmission industry, the wind power industry, the building and tower construction industries. And so it is, in my opinion, an example of how government should function. This cooperative approach has supported economic enterprise while conserving migratory birds. And in fact, that's why we have a Migratory Bird Treaty Act to conserve and protect migratory birds. And at the foundation of this framework, of this cooperative framework, is the decades-long interpretation, as you've pointed out, Congressman and Lynn, Scarlett, that across Republican and Democratic administrations, that the MBTA strictly forbids the take of migratory birds, including take that's incidental to otherwise lawful activities. But were it not for that potential liability, most of these cooperative agreements that I mentioned would never have been consummated. And without that liability, those agreements will wither with time under the pressure of mission and profit. And the real tragedy is that the department didn't need to go in this direction, and particularly when evidence continues to mount, as Amanda has told us, that migratory birds are in great peril from a vast array of threats. Rather, the department could have continued along the path that we'd begun to blaze during the Obama administration, transforming those existing broad cooperative frameworks into expansive general permits, as your bill provides, Congressman, providing government and industry with assurance of compliance and supporting more effective enforcement when enforcement is necessary. So, Congressman, I want to thank you and your co-sponsors for your leadership in introducing HR 5552, which will enact this type of permit program. It will restore the legal protection for birds, but allow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to issue permits that will ratify compliance rather than using enforcement discretion, which admittedly is an uncomfortable currency of compliance for many industries. And in the past, that's been the rub with the MBTA. The only thing that we could offer industry is if you implement these cooperative best management practices, you don't have to worry about one of our agents knocking at your door. And for a lot of industries, admittedly, that's an uncooperative assurance. It's not a strict guarantee, and not something that they can take to a bank or an investor and say, yes, I have a permit for this activity that will cover me. So we need a Migratory Bird Treaty Act that actually protects migratory birds. And Congressman Lowenthal, please count on the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and our members for support in your effort. And in fact, in 2019, AZA added North American songbirds to its signature Saving Animals from Extinction or SAFE program with 29 AZA member participants and external partners, including the American Bird Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Safe North American Songbird Program recognizes the growing concern over wildlife trafficking and illegal trade of songbirds and songbird body parts, and is working with partners to develop an awareness campaign across our 200 million member visitors that will communicate how the MBTA can be used as a conservation tool, what it prohibits, and what to do about suspected violations. So thanks again for allowing us to participate in today's panel, and look forward to questions and discussions. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Great panel. I'm so glad to have each of you here with us today. At this time, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I do want to mention, again, I'll do another plug for Representative Lowenthal's bill, but I think, like he said, we have a couple more days, just a few more days to get co-sponsors, and I believe it's at 80 now as of this morning. So, you know, if we could get that to 100, that would be great. So please be sure to check out the legislation if you haven't already. We would love to see your boss on it. But if anybody has any questions, type them into the chat box. If not, I've got some questions that I can ask our panelists. So I'll just give maybe a minute or two, and then I'll start rolling, or I'll start rolling now with questions, and then people can type them as I'm asking. So Dan, my first question is for you. So what are some of the, we've talked about best management practices that can be implemented, but what are some of the, and this, you know, if Dan, feel free to pass this along to any of the other panelists, but what are some of the common sense best management practices that we would expect to see implemented underneath the Migratory Bird Protection Act if it was enacted? So what are things that some of these companies can do to help mitigate bird deaths?
Yeah, so you know, for instance, with the with open oil pits, that's been like one of the longest and best examples. Is all they have to do is screen the pit, and so cover the pit. And actually, enforcement's been pretty easy, because the Fish and Wildlife Service agents would get in a plane and fly, and they would look for open oil pits, and they would, if they saw some, they would go down on the ground and they would, you know, notify the operator that they are potentially taking birds, and notify them that the best practice is to put screen up, and then would come back, you know, months later and see if it had screened, and if not, they would issue them a warning, and then if they came back again months later and found it was still not screened, then they would look for birds, and if they found them, then they would cite them. So so you knew what the practice was. You were notified that you may be taking birds in violation of the law. You were told how to avoid that loss. And then with the wind power industry, the same thing, a kind of cooperative, negotiated process where you first of all try to site facilities in places that are not going to, that are least likely to present significant harm for bird collisions. With the building industry, lighting, you know, and how to light buildings. Same thing with the tower industry, how to use lightings and to place and operate lighting in a way that is least likely to cause a collision with birds. And so just many examples of best practices across industries, and Amanda and others probably can add some richness to that.
Yeah, let me dive in here as well. Thank you, Dan, for all of that. 2 points. One, a lot of these measures are actually very cost-effective, not expensive. For example, the lighting on some towers, often the lighting is already there, and it's a matter of operating them differently. That is, in a strobe way rather than a steady state. In the case of some fishing practices, fishermen and women have added weights to the drag line so that they sink faster and deeper, and therefore don't adversely affect seabirds. So lots of opportunities, and many of the best practices, very readily doable.
I'm now unmuted. I'd like to add something too, that as was pointed out by Dan and also by Lynn, these best practices many times were generated by the industry themselves. The industries have helped to create them. So that's the first thing. Second is, there's not the long arm of government in the sense of somebody coming in and saying you're meeting these or not. These are self-certifications. People will certify that they're following these best practices. And as Dan points out, they will get a general permit to show that, and as long as they follow that, that if they do not have open oil pits, if they do deal with sighting for certain things, that they will not, for the incidental loss of birds, they will not be penalized. But we're talking about negligence, and when there are negligence which was not directly planned for, but companies were in a sense to kill birds, but companies have been negligent, then we must have protection, or else, as was pointed out earlier, we're going to lose our bird population completely. So I think this is a very common sense, should be a bipartisan bill. It is not the long arm of government. There is not overreach in this. I think that if people study the bill, and that's why we want others, both Republicans and Democrats, to get on, they will see that this is really just putting into law what we've been doing for 100 years. And we've all been able to live with this, and hopefully we'll be able to protect our migratory bird protection, migratory birds better than what now, with the undoing of this, they're all at risk.
Congressman, I think you got a question that was, is there a Senate counterpart to your bill?
I have not seen the Senate counterpart. We are hoping to get it out, and I'm sure there will be. I think there are many senators that are involved in looking at this in a bipartisan way. We've got to get it out of the House right away to demonstrate that there's support. Unfortunately, there have been too many bills that, you know, get out of the House and then they get to the Senate and they never get taken up. I think that if we can demonstrate bipartisan support in the House, that there will be a Senate counterpart, and hopefully it'll be a bipartisan Senate counterpart.
Yes, definitely. Amanda, question for you. So, you know, we know that birds play an important role in our ecosystems, as you mentioned, as indicator species, and contribute a lot to local economies. So, and from your presentation also, we've seen that, you know, they are in deep declines, and it's, you know, very alarming. And so how do you think enacting the Migratory Bird Protection Act, can you expand a little bit on how that would benefit some of these bird populations, and then also, you know, subsequently benefit the human population as well?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, there are, I mean, as I was explaining in the presentation, you know, birds are facing a variety of threats, you know, throughout the annual cycle. And some of these that we know that the Migratory Bird Protection Act would be, you know, helping to regulate and trying to encourage these best practices are going to be particularly important for some vulnerable species. So they're already in decline. And at that point, you know, any additional mortality can actually be devastating to the populations. So in some of the examples, when we looked at like collisions with tall structures, you know, we can actually align the research that's been done, looking across the country, compiling and analyzing the many different studies that have occurred about which species are most susceptible to dying by collision with tall structures. Many of the most vulnerable species are actually some of our strongest declining species. So there are cases where I think it's reasonable to expect that these additional mortality sources would be contributing to population declines. And so that is, I think sometimes when we see a counter argument that people will offer is that, well, these birds are declining, you know, from many different causes. You know, it's not only from these human activities, but I'd suggest that that argument, we don't actually act on that when it comes to human health or many other challenges, right? When you know there are important contributors, even if they're occurring among other pressures like habitat loss, it's still important to act. So yeah, at this point, with the declines we're seeing, any additional mortality sources are things we want to avoid. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Amanda. This can be any of the panelists, feel free to answer this one. So would general permits be available for non-energy producing industries?
I certainly they would be. I think that we've just heard some examples, and so if they can develop best practices, which the industry knows that they can follow, that there's agreement within the industry and Fish and Wildlife that these are practices that can be done. We're not into penalizing those other industries. We do not just target oil and gas and fishing, but what we're trying to do is to promote best practices, to develop a system where people will just self-certify that they're able to follow those, We're not making it impossible. And was pointed out, this is not going to solve all the problems of loss of migratory birds, but it's what we can do now to do our share of making sure that, and then we can deal later on and people, about issues around habitat restoration, which we have to deal with, and other issues that we know are going on, which are, interestingly enough, the Congress is now beginning to understand those. We've just seen we've just done, even though it's not in the Migratory Bird Protection Act, but by passing it sets a message that we're concerned about these issues. And we're also concerned, we're seeing in the latest bill that just went out, the Moving Forward bill out of the House, in terms of broadband and infrastructure and transportation and housing and school construction, that there really is a concern about restoration economy. And this would be, again, very consistent with that.
Steve, I see you have, sorry, Amanda. Steve, I see you have joined. Steve Homer with the American Bird Conservancy. Is there something that you wanted to add? He's one of our policy experts on this issue.
Sure. Well, communications towers is a great example where a best management practice has been developed, which is to change the lighting for the tall towers. About 7 million birds a year die from colliding with these towers when they're attracted to the steady burning red lights. And thanks to a policy change and the new best management practices, the tower operators can turn off those steady burning lights, which will save about 70% of the birds that might otherwise be affected. And it also saves electricity and reduces their annual operating cost. So it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what the Congressman said. I think when I was at the Fish and Wildlife Service, when we began to work on a permit program, the first idea was to take all of those areas where we already had agreements and just essentially transfer them into general permits. So with the longline fishing industry, with the electric transmission industry, with the wind power industry, the places where we had those kind of well-defined cooperative agreements, just take those and essentially transfer them into a general permit. So far, far beyond the energy production industries.
Yeah, and if I could add too, at least, my understanding of the permitting process, and I think, others can also speak to this more than I, but that actually is going to provide more regulatory certainty than even the alternatives, the proposed changes to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. In the EIS, the draft EIS, they were referring to the patchwork of state regulations that industry would still have to navigate, that are especially industries operating across state lines. This permitting process would actually, really be more secure for a lot of these industries than the alternative, as I understand.
Yeah, and that gets back to the kind of tragedy. I think this administration, earlier in the administration, Lynn, Scarlett, and I joined other former government officials in writing to former Secretary Zinke, and we offered to work with the department. We never got a response to that letter or offer of support. And I think what this policy is going to change, because it'll be this administration or the next administration or this Congress or the next Congress, because Americans support the conservation of birds. And so I think what this administration still has the chance to do is put in place a much more enduring framework that will provide certainty to industries. We would all be much better off if we went down that path and worked in a cooperative way to put that kind of framework in place, rather than this constant swinging broadly between policy extremes.
Yeah, and I want to build on Dan's comments. I spent 8 years at the Interior Department in the G.W. Bush administration and always thought the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the effort to use that act as a basis for engaging cooperatively across a spectrum of companies was exactly what the congressman said, basic common sense. It provides consistency. It provides certainty, the kind of certainty that companies and the ag sector and so forth are looking for, and it provides that protection of birds that was envisioned in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And I just want to add one more layer that some people have mentioned. You know, I am a birder, and I'm passionate about going out and seeing the beauty of these birds, but we must remember that they have enormous relevance and benefits to each and every American across the country. Pollination, birds are critical to that process. So the agricultural sector, in so many ways, birds are beneficial to all of us. Yes, we love their aesthetics. I love their aesthetics, but they are a bedrock need. I like to say that nature's not just nice, it's essential. And so is that true with birds.
Yeah, great point, Lynn. And yeah, and I think, Dan, I mean, you brought up about how there's been a lot of opposition, you know, to these changes that the administration has made to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And, you know, it was great to see such a strong showing of support from former officials. You, Lynn and Dan, you both mentioned this, but letters from officials spanning back from the President Nixon administration all the way up into President Obama, writing about how they were concerned about this reinterpretation of the law. And so I think that that's really important when, you know, thinking about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as a whole, about how, you know, how much bipartisan support it has had in the past.
Yeah, and I would just taking off on what Lynn and the Congressman and Amanda have said is I remember a few years ago, one of my Fish and Wildlife Service colleagues said, you know, where birds thrive, people prosper. And I think that's, you know, to me, that kind of well said, right? That, that you know, we are kind of intimately linked with the well-being of bird life, so.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing too many more questions. Do you guys have any last words to add, or anything else that you'd like to say to our participants?
I see a question here in the chat to the panelists about the argument that some might have about the bird take that's regulated as part of Migratory Bird Treaty Act might be dwarfed by like other mortality sources like cats, for example. There's a lot of publicity about the impact cats can have on birds. And it's true, we care about cats as a mortality source, definitely encourage, you know, to keep cats indoors. But the point I would make is that when we're dealing with a lot of these complex problems, again, we need to be addressing each of the contributing factors. The issue of cats killing birds, as serious as that is, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be acting and taking positive steps to address the fact that 1/4 of the human-caused mortality of birds results from industrial activities. We can do something about that mortality source, and so we should.
Yes, great point, Amanda. Thank you for catching that. Any last words from anybody?
I just want to encourage all those that are watching this, the congressional offices, to really, if they have not become their bosses, or she or he have not become co-sponsors, bipartisan. This is good common sense policy. This is, you know, what we're saying is that we're not, you know, incidental take, which is due to best practices, and when as long as you're covering your pits and you're dealing with the lighting, we're not going to penalize you. But unfortunately, as what happened in the Deepwater Horizon, that was due to negligence. And if we do not have something to protect incidental take that was due to negligence, the millions of dollars that were gained that really did went for habitat restoration would never have happened. And so not only would we have lost large numbers of birds. We would not have done habitat restoration. And so this is common sense. It's not punitive. And I encourage everyone to sign on, co-sign.
Yes, very well said, Congressman. I think that that is a good place to leave it. So thank you everybody for joining us. This has been really great. I hope you've learned something at least about Representative Lowenthal's bill, but also about birds in general. And thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.